Hello, Virtual English 2 students, and welcome to the penultimate, the second to last day of our reading of Langston Hughes, Walker with the Dawn section of his collection of poems, Dreamkeeper and Other Poems. My name is Paul Davidson, here to read you some poems. Today we're going to be reading Lincoln Monument, Washington, and we're going to be reading Aunt Sue's Stories. So the first one we're going to start off with is Lincoln Monument, Washington. So this poem is similar to the one we read yesterday, Alabama Earth, where this was written for an event and read at the event. So Alabama Earth was written for Booker Washington's funeral. This one was written for the dedication, the opening of the Lincoln Monument back in whenever it was opened up. So Langston Hughes wrote this poem and read it at the opening. Keep in mind that it was written for that. That was the purpose it was written for. The one thing I want you to look at this time around, because we look at first, last lines of the poem, the senses that is appealed to, so your imagery, so your sense of sight, smell, taste, touch, and hearing. That's imagery. So what I want you to really, really focus on for this poem is imagery. There's visual imagery in here, but audio imagery is the one I want you to focus on, how this poem sounds. All right, so we're going to do that while we read it. And one of the things, think about legacy. That's kind of the idea that this poem is exploring. One of the ideas this poem is exploring is legacy. Lincoln Monument, Washington. Let's go see old Abe, sitting in the marble in the moonlight, sitting lonely in the marble in the moonlight. Quiet for 10,000 centuries, old Abe. Quiet for a million years. Quiet. And yet a voice forever against the timeless walls of time, old Abe. So what I recommend to my face-to-face students is you sit here for a minute, write down your thoughts, your initial thoughts that you have, because writing equals thinking, thinking equals learning. So just write down what you think about this particular poem. The one thing I want us to focus in on is that second quiet, that third quiet. Langston Hughes actually makes the reader, makes us, while you're reading in your head, become quiet before he hits us with a wall of sound. So yes, he first does this through repetition. Quiet, 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 kind of lulling us into a sense of, oh. I do like the first two quiets, kind of like hyperbolating and amping up, like the loneliness that and the foreverness that Abe Lincoln is experiencing without us. And then we get to years and we have a period. And with a period, we stop, we pause. So the period automatically makes us pause. If you look at the actual poem itself, there's a line, there is a space, that space makes us pause. And then we have quiet with a dash, another pause. There's a lot of empty space, quietness, just right there through using words. And of course, then he comes through with how his voice lasts forever. His voice won't stop sounding. And that's kind of what really helps pound home his point, the greater point that they're trying to make about legacy. The other poem also deals with legacy. The first two poems were men that did great things, great men of history. But, powerful men aren't the only ones who are allowed to have a legacy. This shows us another type of legacy, Aunt Sue's Stories. So Aunt Sue's Stories, of course, talks about legacy, as I mentioned. It also a little bit talks about family. This is a 3-act kind of poem. There's 3 acts to this poem. There are 4 stanzas, but it kind of acts in 3 acts. That last stanza is kind of just a reiteration, like a hammering home the point that they're trying to make. So there's 3 pictures that are going to be painted. Visual imagery is the big one that we need to focus on here. There's 3 pictures that are going to be painted. And just think about what these pictures are. All right. So I'm going to read it. I recommend you pause the video for a minute, write down your initial thoughts, because writing equals thinking, thinking equals learning. And then I'll talk a little bit more about it. Aunt Sue's Stories by Langston Hughes. Aunt Sue has a head full of stories. Aunt Sue has a whole heart full of stories. Summer nights on the front porch, Aunt Sue cuddles a brown-faced child to her bosom and tells him stories. Black slaves working in the hot sun, blacks and black slaves walking in the dewy night, and black slaves singing sorrow songs on the banks of the mighty river, mingling themselves softly in the flow of old Aunt Sue's voice, mingling themselves softly in the dark shadows that cross and recross Aunt Sue's stories. And the dark-faced child listening knows that Aunt Sue's stories are real stories. He knows that Aunt Sue never got her stories out of any book at all, but they came right out of her own life. And the dark-faced child is quiet of a summer night listening to Aunt Sue's stories. We also see a little bit of imagery, audio imagery there because, the child's quiet. Imagine she's rocking the child, trying to get this child to sleep. And so as she's telling the stories, the child drifts off to sleep quietly. The three acts. We have three pictures that are painted in our heads. The first picture, of course, is of the exposition of Aunt Sue, an older Black woman sitting on a porch, rocking a young Black child. That's the first image that pops into our head. A couple things I want you all to think about. Aunt Sue has a head full of stories. What does it mean to have a head full of stories? And then Aunt Sue has a whole heart full of stories. So what does it mean to have a head full of stories? What does it mean to have a whole heart full of stories? Then we move into Act 2, the second image that we get, which is of that older Black woman, now a younger Black woman. Now she is a slave. But it's not necessarily the horrors that we normally associate with slavery. It's not the it does talk about the hardships a little bit, but it's not the atrocities that we usually associate with slavery. Working in the hot sun, everybody has to work though. Walking in the dewy night, singing the sorrow songs on the bank of the mighty Mississippi. It's not talking about like the horrible beatings. It's not talking about the horrible like mistreatment of the slaves. She's telling these stories and like something that happened while they were working, something that happened while they were walking through the dewy night, them singing the songs. She's trying. So whenever we share stories, we try to share like memorable stories, and we try to share like more happy stories. We don't really share sad stories as much as we do happy stories orally. And so she shares these stories, yet they're always tinged with a hint of sadness. And this line right here today really stood out to me while reading this. Mingling themselves softly in the dark shadows that cross and recross Aunt Sue's stories. Because in that line, in the dark shadows that cross and recross. Because at the end of the day, these are stories about when she was a slave. And so there is a dark shadow that kind of attaches to it. There's a sadness that still, it's hard to shake from these particular stories. We get into Act 3, that third stanza. We now shift back, but the focus is no longer on Aunt Sue. The focus is on the child, and the child is very intently wrapped up in these stories. He's listening intently to what is going on. What does this poem say about our legacy? Who can have a legacy? How do we continue our legacy? Who continues our legacy? What does this poem say about family? That's all I have for you today. Tomorrow, I'll be back with day 7 and the last day that we'll be reading these poems. All right. Until then, see you later. Bye.